Immortal 3, Stiller of Souls, by Valjean Jeffers. Narrated by Valjean Jeffers. Chapter 1. Laid Bare. Topaz, 2175. Annabelle sat on her porch, watching them as they shuffled past. The weeping willows and bluish-brown waters were a soothing backdrop to their passage. Shacks lined the main road. Clusters of the little wooden houses were scattered behind it. To the left sprawled Master's 100 acres of farmland. To the right, for a half-mile, his serfdom continued. Sharecroppers, ages 12 to 50, trundled along the dusty road. Jet black, ginger, caramel brown, tofu and butter-colored. The men wore patched shirts and threadbare trousers. The women calico dresses, their hair tied back with colorful scarves or threaded with string. 50 years ago, their mamas and daddies had belonged to old Master, now long since in his grave. Today, the law said they belonged to themselves. But young Master Tom, with his frigid blue eyes and corn silk hair, owned them, like his father before him, just not in name. Year after year, they planted cane and cotton. They paid Tom rent to live in his shacks. They bought supplies in his grocery, shoes, bolts of cloth, tools. So by the end of the year, they owed their wages to him and had to spend the next paying it off. They belonged to Master still, even if that proclamation did free the slaves. The sharecroppers greeted her as they passed. "Evening, Miss Annabelle," Lizzie, an ebony-skinned girl of 12, sang as she walked alongside her tired mother. "Evening, Lizzie." "Mabel." "Evening, Miss Annabelle." The old woman took a wooden pipe from the tin plate beside her and filled it with tobacco. She puffed serenely, watching their exodus as the setting illuminae painted the horizon violet and gold. Annabelle was dark brown and thin to the point of emaciation, with a wide nose and thick lips. Her bony skull peeked through sparse gray hair pinned into a bun at the nape of her neck. Her brown eyes were rheumy, her face heavily lined. She looked to be 100. In truth, she was much older. She'd earned her cabin, free monthly rations and tobacco as a young woman working in the fields for old Master Henry. That was before she caught his eye, before he brought her into the big house as mammy to his son. Later, she became his lover. Mistress Sarah always knew Henry had a taste for slave women. After a while, it seemed all he had a taste for was Annabelle. The slave community had whispered about this. Sarah could be a real hellraiser when she took a mind to it. She'd been known to throw tantrums that included throwing dishes at Henry, and often had his lovers whipped and sold in his absence. Now her husband's favorite concubine was mammy to her son. The quarter held its breath and waited for the fireworks. But Sarah never raised a hand to Annabelle, and she kept her mouth shut. So night after night, Henry visited Annabelle's little shack, often not emerging until the next morning. It seemed he couldn't get enough of her black flesh, until he was too old to do anything more than dream about it. She smiled to herself. He never knew he was shortening his own days. The old woman rose gingerly to her feet and hobbled inside to check on dinner. Pushed against the right wall was a feather bed. At the end of the bed was a mirror, as tall as she, with a carved wooden frame, both gifts from Henry. To the left, iron pots and pans hung from the wall. Underneath, a bucket was filled with dishes, and beside it one for drawing water. Across from the bed was a fireplace. A pot filled with mustard greens and salt pork hung over the glowing coals. Hoe cake bread lay amongst the ashes. Annabelle fished a plate out of the bucket and walked over to the fireplace to fix a plate. "Do it after dinner, after they eat." Chapter 1. Laid Bare. Part 2. Darkness had fallen, and everyone was asleep except for the bullfrogs and crickets. It was a weeknight, and any man, woman, or child who had a mind to work tomorrow was in bed, except at Elmo's juke joint, where the night crowd still lounged about, drinking and dancing to the low-down blues. Folks brave enough or stupid enough to think that they could guzzle hooch for half the night and work the next day. The juke was the only thing in the vicinity that Master Tom didn't own. It belonged to Elmo, a strapping quadroon, but he paid Master to let him stay in business, and Tom in turn kept him supplied with corn liquor and beer. Annabelle stepped out into the warm night air. Above her, clouds billowed past two swollen orange globes. Elmo's joint was 2 miles down the road, and behind a thicket of trees next to the river. In the distance, beyond the churning waters, she could see the lights of the juke. She could see inside, too. Johnny was 6 feet 2 inches of lithe muscles, his skin the color of brown sugar, his hair black and curly, his teeth like rice. He'd been a ladies' man before he married, and nobody in the quarter could quite believe it when, out of the gaggle of women that surrounded him, he'd chosen Sadie, a timid little thing with about as much sex appeal as one of the bullfrogs now serenading the lake. 6 months later, everybody knew why. Sadie was so happy to have him, she let him do whatever he wanted. Johnny's affairs with other women were so frequent they'd become legendary, and made his wife the object of pity. Still, Johnny always managed to put in a full day's work, no matter what he did the night before. The quarter gossiped about this too. His drinking was sure to catch up to him one day, that or the women. It was sure to kill him. Annabelle shuffled over to the tin and picked up her pipe. She sucked upon it and blew, all the while murmuring softly. Smoke rose into the air, thickening into a fog. It spread quickly through the quarter and over the river's churning waters. To Elmo's juke joint. She chuckled. Now they're asleep. I ain't got to worry about some nosy rascal sticking his nose in my business. The old woman laughed out loud, unbuttoned her calico shift and let it fall to her ankles. Annabelle kicked free of it and pulled the pins from her hair. Naked in the moonlight, she whispered his name. Johnny! Now beyond the forest, the faint sound of drums began, invisible hands beating upon skin. Their rhythm swirled about the trees, moving over the river. In the juke, women and men drowsed with their heads resting upon tables or lying on the floor. Elmo had fallen asleep leaning against a wall. Resting at his feet was a young man with light skin and black hair curled against his scalp. Suddenly Johnny lifted his head. Without so much as a glance at his sleeping fellows, the youth got to his feet and stepped out into the fog. He followed the dirt path, his feet floating just above the earth, carried onward by the mist suffusing the night air. Johnny walked in the midst of a dream. He climbed the porch steps to meet her, a dark woman with a thick mass of unruly hair, taut skin, full breasts and buttocks, and fell on his knees before her. The drums grew louder. Clasping her thighs, he rubbed his lips against them. Annabelle filled her hand with his curls and pulled Johnny up to face her. He did not resist. Still holding his head, she pressed her lips to his, then wound her arms about his neck. Her lover cupped her buttocks and lifted her from the floor. She threw her head back, moaning low in her throat like a cat. Her teeth lengthened, grew pointed, and she sank them into his neck. Johnny groaned with pleasure. Annabelle lifted her mouth and licked the bloody punctures with her tongue. As they vanished, life filled her body. Minutes, hours, days, teasing and satisfying. A cry, shocking in its intensity, forced its way past her lips. The pleasure so exquisite, she was tempted to take more. No, remember last time. He carried her across the threshold to the soft feather bed. Johnny was her favorite, a consummate lover who knew just how to please a woman, just where to touch her, just how to grind his narrow hips. And he was a womanizer, a much right man, as the Indigo Quarter described him, much right for one woman as he was for the next, and a hard drinker to boot. No one would be suspicious if he dropped dead at 50 instead of 75. When she'd had her fill of him, Johnny stretched out on her mattress, his eyes half-lidded, his face vacuous. Tomorrow he'd relive their night together as nothing more than a reverie. But he can't sleep here. Go home, she whispered. Without a word, her lover dressed and staggered home to his wife. He didn't look back. Annabelle sauntered out the back door to the water pump, naked as she was, to wash his seed from her body. She jerked the handle hard to get a clean flow, splashing water between her thighs. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw him watching her. Chapter 2. Death. It was a boy child who'd stepped outside to urinate. He paused in his task, staring at the naked woman with huge, unblinking eyes. "Come here," she commanded softly. Obediently, he buttoned his pants and walked through the long grass to stand before her, a boy of 10, almost as tall as Annabelle, with a muscular build. "That's Ginger Snap, Bessie Mae's boy." Bessie, Jim, and their 6 children shared the cabin next door. Ginger Snap, so nicknamed because of his yellowish-brown skin, and whose real name was Charlie, was their oldest child. Annabelle sized him up. He was still fast asleep, but the mist affected children differently from adults. They saw and heard more while under its spell, later to be remembered as dreams or nightmares. What's he going to tell his mama tomorrow morning when he wakes up? Would Ginger Snap tell Bessie he dreamt of a naked young woman washing herself at the pump behind Annabelle's cabin? A young woman who didn't fit the description of anyone living in the quarter, but who, Bessie would know, looked exactly as Annabelle had in her youth. And what would she make of her child's story? Bessie was as superstitious as everyone else in the quarter. Ghosts and witches were everyday events, no more unusual than the orange-tinted moons floating above her. Ginger Snap hadn't moved. He stood patiently, awaiting her next command. Annabelle had never stolen from a child, but not out of pity. Men from birth to death were vermin, pets to do with as she pleased. She took what she needed and cast them aside. Still, children didn't wither and die like adults. Stealing from them meant taking dangerous risks. I should kill him, snap his neck like a chicken and hide his body in the woods. Maybe tie a rock around him and tell him to walk into the river. Might be months before they find him. Might be never. Mama? Ginger Snap screwed up his face and began to cry. Annabelle recoiled as if slapped. Pain from near-forgotten memories cutting her to the quick. Memories of an ancient promise. You being a natural thing. I ain't your mama, she hissed. Go back to bed. She watched him shuffle back to his cabin. The night, so exquisitely begun, had left a vile taste in her mouth. 70 years ago, Annabelle had arrived with a cartel of slaves. A young woman, dark and comely, she'd fetched a tidy price. The indigo and copper community didn't wonder that she'd arrived without family. So many of them had seen their kin, husbands, wives, daughters, sons, sold away from them. But Annabelle was fickle, changing lovers like shoes. She seemed to have no heart, and she was barren, yet men flocked to her like bees to honey. She exerted a strange control over everyone she touched. After a time, the quarter began to whisper about her, and in the years to come, no relative ever sought her out, even though the proclamation had set them free. Annabelle was an oddity, a woman without family who could make the master do her bidding, somebody to be feared. The children didn't play about her steps or clamber onto her porch in the evening as they did with the other old folks. She was treated with polite, distant respect. They mamas and daddies talk about me. I know they do. Now Ginger Snap's seen me. It's time to go. Before one of 'em sprinkles something in my garden, or my clothes while they hanging on the line. The woman climbed the steps and walked back inside. She took a long look at the cabin that had been her home for more than 60 years and continued out the front door, picking her way through the long grass. Now she regretted not taking more from Johnny when she'd had the chance. I could call him back to finish him off, but I never did that before. I never called one back twice. Annabelle walked to the river's edge and shut her eyes. She breathed in the moist night air, letting it caress her skin, roll over her tongue, ooze past her mouth and nostrils. Then she turned and retraced her steps, savoring the feel of the rough, patchy grass between her toes. She climbed the steps to her cabin and paused, looking down at her pipe. She picked it up and snapped it in half, then placed the pieces beside the ashtray and continued inside. Annabelle pulled her gown on and lay up on the bed. Her breathing slowed until it was only a whisper, her body growing rigid, becoming an elderly woman's once more. A mist crept from her frame. It hovered over her, suddenly bursting into iridescent beads that fluttered about like fireflies. They soared to the mirror, shimmering upon the glass. Annabelle's chest rose and fell. Then she was still. On the other side of time, a fair-skinned daemon stood atop a rocky precipice. His long robes undulated in the winds, making him look like a great bird of prey. Hector shut his turquoise blue eyes and let his body stiffen, slipping into a trance. Across the void, two shapes wavered and came into focus. The first, Geth, was a powerfully muscled creature with eyes like black pebbles. He was covered with green scales. Golden talons glittered on his hands and feet. Beside him sat Paltus, a withered blue demon with the head of a hawk. His black eyebrows curled upward to frame his bald skull, and he had silver talons on his fingers and toes. These were the reviled, Geth and his brother Paltus. "Have you found her?" Geth hissed. "Yes, my lord. She spoke to me from beyond the abyss," Hector answered. "She is coming." Part 1. Like a gal starving, I'm hungry for your touch. Need your loving bad, just can't get enough. Come on over, Daddy. Fill your baby up. Salty Papa Blues, from the Book of Legend. Chapter 3. The Revolution. Topaz 2676. The time of legend had come to Tundra, the time of revolution, and New World Topaz reflected the turmoil boiling across the planet. Suburbs shared blocks with bomb sites. Upscale city flats sat next door to the rotten skeletons of buildings. Topaz Bridge could be seen from anywhere in the city, but the comely blue-green waters of the bay flowing beneath it were poisoned. It was a city of violence, of gangs warring for territory, of hungry citizens rioting, of drug addiction and thievery. Race wars erupted across Tundra, but many citizens, especially the younger ones, came together united by poverty and oppression. Communes of diverse races sprang up. Bartering for food, water, and other necessities became popular. 1 year ago, the werewolves Carl and Joseph had journeyed to this time from the 29th century. They came in fulfillment of a prophecy that foretold the coming of a new age, an age that would see an end to war, hunger, and racism. The prophecy also spoke of 6 others, Joan, José, Consuela, and Mark, who would fight at their side. And the prophecy spoke of a council who would take a stand against corrupt politicians. For in the year 2675, the global corporations controlled the planet's wealth and hoarded its resources, while working and middle-class citizens scuffled for crumbs from their table. So Topaz's citizens nominated the council to take back their province. Across the planet Tundra, world councils representing their citizens were elected. But the demon Teotep pursued the others into the time of legend, for he knew of another prophecy, one in which he ruled Tundra, one that spoke of darkness covering the planet for 1,000 years. If he could rewrite history. The corporations put a price on the council's head. In a street war that was still whispered about on the grapevine, the others fought against the gangs. Even with the council's warriors fighting with them, the others were outnumbered, yet they possessed supernatural speed and strength. Soon, only a handful of their enemies were standing. Hundreds of enforcers arrived and came to the gang's defense. Then things really got strange. 5 guardians appeared and the battle began anew. While they fought, Teotep crept into the council's bedrooms. To anyone looking on, it would seem that he'd planned to murder them to sabotage the revolution. But his ambitions were not so simple. For if he murdered the council, history would be rewritten, and the demon prophecy would come to pass. That same night, an enforcer slipped away from the guards and tasered the others, while Teotep crept into the council's brownstone. But he only succeeded in killing 4 members. Joan, Consuela, José and Mark took the place of the victims with the surviving council members, Naomi and Michael. They were elected to serve for the next 5 years. This new high council ended the wars. Carla and Joseph returned to the year 3075, and a new world began. Chapter 4, Awakening, Topaz 2676. Sonia stood before the mirror, holding the long-sleeved knitted blouse against her body. Schools had just reopened this year after the wars ended, and normal HS semesters were running through the summer, but she didn't care. She was graduating this year. Cute, but it's too hot to wear now. She walked over to the bed and picked up a t-shirt from among her selections. Topaz mornings were cool, but I can wear a sweater the first part of the day. The girl held the shirt against her body, turning to get a side view in the glass. Yeah, this would look good with some jeans. It was only last year that Sonia had begun to appreciate her tall, slender body, her full breasts, narrow hips, and rounded bottom with long legs. She'd even made peace with her wide nose and dark brown complexion, but she liked her wavy hair best of all. Lighter indigo and bronze citizens, especially females with straight hair, were preferred mates. The informal color caste system of Topaz made this a fact. It wasn't spoken about, never discussed in polite company. It just was. Then her best friend Nona told her about a boy that actually had a crush on her. Girl, he said every time he see you, he thinks about milk chocolate, dark and sweet. The boy was Darren, honey-colored and muscular, with a clean-shaven head, aquiline nose, and full lips. But his eyes were brown, slanted, and they followed her every move. Each time Sonia caught him looking at her, she felt like melting chocolate on the inside. Tomorrow Nona's gonna hook us up. I'm not gonna be able to sleep. Thinking about tomorrow made her feel all fluttery inside. So the indigo girl pushed these thoughts aside and picked up the jeans. She held them against her waist, gazing into the glass. I love this mirror. Chapter 4, Awakening, Part 2, Topaz 2676. It was the single touch of elegance in the tiny house she shared with her mother, sister, and 2 brothers. Cassandra had given it to Sonia last year on her 16th birthday, just as the gift had been passed to Cassandra by Sonia's grandmother. Sonia's father had been killed in the wars, leaving her mother to fend for herself with 4 children. They were lucky to have a roof over their heads at all. So she kept her chagrin about the cramped living space to herself and her pride in the mirror. It was tall enough to match her height, with glass as clear as raindrops, and a wooden frame carved with all manner of birds, wolves, cats, and others she couldn't even recognize. She'd once tried to follow the etched shapes with her eyes until she made herself dizzy. How long did it take to do this? How many hours? The mirror was exquisite, and it was all hers. But late at night sometimes the glass would go dark, as if a muddy river was running over it. And one night Sonia could swear she'd glimpsed people moving behind the glass. She'd lain in bed gazing at them, unable to look away, a scream trembling on her lips. I thought for sure I was going to get rid of it the next day. As soon as morning came, I was going to tell Mama to sell it. By the illuminate's first light, she changed her mind. When Sonia finally cornered Cassandra, she didn't mention the specters she'd glimpsed, only the inexplicable changes in the glass. Her mother's eyes had shifted away from her daughter's, and down to the pot she was stirring. "You're probably just imagining things. Sometimes at night, the shadows play tricks with our eyes." Before Sonia could say another word, she'd shooed her away. "Honey, Mama's real busy right now. Ain't you supposed to be watching the kids for me?" At 17, Sonia was almost an adult, but still enough of a child to know that Cassandra's face was one that grown-ups made when they were hiding something. The next epiphany struck her like lightning. "Mama's scared of it too. But then, why did she give it to me?" The dark girl carefully laid her choice of clothing on the battered armchair across from her bed. She hung the rest of her clothes in the tiny closet facing her bed, got undressed, picked up her long nightshirt, and slipped it on. She started to climb into bed, changed her mind, and walked back to the mirror. On impulse, she laid her palm on the glass, and was not the least surprised to feel it grow warm beneath her touch. All at once the mirror gleamed with an orange-reddish light, and Sonia shivered, no longer afraid, but yearning. Chapter 5. Innocence Lost. After the first session of classes, Nona cornered Sonia at her locker. Darren and Nona's beau, Willie, a tall, dark, bow-legged youth with thick hair trimmed into a cloud about his face, stood beside her. Sonia hugged her books to her chest, leaning against the metal panel. She wore the short-sleeved shirt and hip-hugging jeans she'd picked out the night before. Her thick, wavy hair spread out over her shoulders. She couldn't meet Darren's eyes, so she turned her attention to Nona, a plump, shapely girl with a long, curly afro that framed her face. Nona's skin was the color of caramel, and she had thick eyebrows, full rosebud lips, and a faint mustache that drove normal HS's male students wild. Nona had told Sonia Willie treated her like a queen, and no stranger to lovemaking. She'd also described the size of Willie's equipment in graphic detail. Gazing at her, Sonia was suddenly consumed with jealousy. "The only reason she's my best friend is 'cause I ain't no competition." Guilt followed on the heels of this thought. Nona had been her best friend since the first grade. Over the years, she'd fought beside Sonia, cried when Sonia cried, told and kept secrets with her. Nona grinned, pushing Darren towards her friend. "Sonia, this is Darren. Darren, Sonia," then grabbed one of Willie's big hands. "Come on, baby. Let's give him some privacy." Willie tipped a wink at Darren, then let Nona drag him away, his long legs moving as gracefully as a panther's. Sonia dropped her eyes to the floor as Darren moved closer to her. "Hey, I'm glad we finally got a chance to meet." "Me too," she stammered. "You know," Darren went on, "you the prettiest girl in school." Sonia protested, smiling. "Yes, you are. I watch you all day, and then when I go home at night, I can still see you." Gazing up at him, Sonia knew her life would never be the same. After finally meeting at school, Sonia and Darren spent every possible moment together. They met at Sonia's locker between classes. Darren walked her home every day and, as soon as his chores were done, rushed back to finish his homework with her. Then they'd snuggle on her ragged couch, listening to the console. Sometimes they'd stay outside, Sonia leaning against him, his arms around her, watching the lights of Topaz Bridge. The city was beautiful at night, when the twin moons rose in the sky, with its steep hills and tree-lined streets, the dust softening the bomb sites and condemned houses. Chapter 5, Innocence Lost, Part 2. At 10 or 11, Cassandra would emerge from her bedroom and lean over the railing behind them, or stick her head outside. Her comments usually ran along the lines of, "Boy, go home. You know it's too late for you to be over here." "Mama," Sonia would protest. Sonia, it's a school night." Or, if it was on the weekend, "It's long past midnight. His mama will be calling over here asking me what kind of house I'm running." "She don't care," Darren would retort. "Well, I do. Now go home." Then Cassandra would smile indulgently. "We'll see you tomorrow." It was Friday, their favorite day of the week, because it meant that he could stay until midnight, even later if Cassandra fell asleep. It was only 11, but Darren already had his hand inside her blouse, squeezing and fondling her breast, both of them listening for the sound of her mother's bedroom door opening. Most nights, Sonia stopped him before he went any further. But tonight, she let him slide his hand down between her legs. Darren gently rubbed the open V, then fingered the snaps on her pants. "Please, Sonia," he whispered, "let me do it to you. I won't hurt you." He unfastened her pants, slipped his hand down inside her panties, and slowly ran his fingers over her hard little nub, then pushed a forefinger inside. "You know I love you." Sonia dug her nails into his arms, soft moans escaping from her lips. "I love you too, but—" He spared another glance at the stairs. "Let's go to your room, okay? Please? Mama will hear us." He kissed her and broke away, breathing hard. "No, she won't. You go up first. I'll wait a little bit, then follow you." With a pounding heart, Sonia crept up the stairs into her bedroom. She wasn't a virgin, but her past fumbling encounters had retreated to the distant shores of her mind, eclipsed by him. She kept her eyes on the door, desire and fear of discovery twisting her stomach into knots. Afraid that the bed would squeak, they spread Sonia's comfort on the floor. She stripped naked and was rewarded by his eyes drinking in the sight of her body like dark wine. Chapter 5, Innocence Lost, Part 3. After that first night, they made love at every opportunity. Cassandra pretended ignorance, but a week later she told the younger children to stay in the living area and call Sonia into the kitchen. Something about her mother's tone frightened Sonia. They'd been so careful. She didn't know. Did she? The indigo girl dragged her feet behind her mother. In the kitchen, she backed against the wall, staring at the floor to avoid Cassandra's searching gaze. "You taking care of yourself?" "Mama, what you talking about?" "Girl, don't play with me," Cassandra shot back. Then she softened. "You're a woman now, and you in love. I can see it in your face. I guess he's in love too, or thinks he is. But you'd be surprised how quickly some men fall out of love when your belly begins to swell." "Darren's not like that," Sonia blurted, then bit her lip. The older woman nodded. "Uh-huh, that's what I thought." "You using anything to keep from getting pregnant?" "Yes, ma'am," Sonia mumbled. "The sheaths." Good, baby. The older woman smiled. That's real good. I knew I didn't raise no fools. For 2 months they were inseparable. But as the 3rd month drew to a close, Darren told her he was moving away. My mama found a better paying job up north. I asked her if I could stay here with my aunt. I begged her, but she said I got to go. I turned 18 this year. I can come back. They clung to each other, Darren crying almost as hard as she was. He promised to write. His letters came every other day for 3 weeks, and suddenly they stopped. She wrote him. Chapter 5, Innocence Lost, Part 4. She sent a 2nd letter, and a 3rd. He never answered. Sonia cried every night after that, curled into a ball in the middle of her bed, unable to sleep, eating just enough to stay alive. She'd never felt such emptiness. Her loss was an ache burning in the pit of her stomach. She attended classes, came home each day to do her chores and homework, but barely opened her mouth to speak, spending most of her time in her bedroom. Louis, Patricia, and even baby Charlie, grieved by the change in their beloved older sister, hovered around her whenever she emerged from her room. But her mother left her alone. Sonia's behavior wasn't all that different from her own when her husband was killed in the wars. Sonia had lost her first love. Cassandra knew the only cure for such things was time. Let me know if you need to talk, baby, was all she said. Chapter 6, Ganas. In the late afternoon, Sonia liked to sit outside and watch the blue and peach setting of the illuminae. When the moons rose, she could see the lights of Topaz Bridge twinkling in the distance. Sonia would close her eyes, let the night breezes caress her face, and imagine dark waters flowing under the bridge, while the streetcars rolled up and down the steep hills. And her pain would fade to a dull twinge. But she began to notice curious rustling in the bushes alongside her house. She could never catch a glimpse of what it was before it scurried out of sight. It's probably just a cat. It sounds kind of big for a cat. So it's a bigger animal. Who cares? She started having nightmares too. Dreams of bending over in a cane field, her head covered by a rag, wearing a rough, shapeless dress, walking through a sleeping quarter, her path lit by the stars. She was following a child, a small boy, leaving the cabins behind her. Lightning flashed in the sky, then a drum roll of thunder. Storm's coming! We got to go back! The rain began to fall, a drizzle at first, then a great downpour. But the boy only looked up at her, water pouring off his small face. He tugged her relentlessly forward, past the cane fields, into the high grass beyond, to the river. Lightning flared in the sky again, silhouetting a 2-story house. It hadn't been there before. The house vanished, lightning flickered, and it was there once more. If Sonia wanted to, she could calculate the time since Darren had left down to the hour. She couldn't remember missing anyone so much except her daddy. He's not coming back. I know he isn't. I just wish I could stop hurting. The bushes on her right shook violently, and she scowled. Here we go again. A paw with black nails crawled over it. Sonia stared in horror as a creature rose from behind the foliage. It was a man covered from head to toe in coarse brown hair. His eyes were a deep shade of violet, his long snout dipped in white, talons curled from his fingers and toes. He grinned at her, exposing jagged, razor-sharp teeth. She leapt up and raced for the door, fumbling for the knob, a scream pouring from her throat. This isn't happening! It can't be happening! In an instant he crossed the distance between them, moving swifter than humanly possible, clapped his hand over her mouth and wrapped his free arm about her throat. "Now," he whispered, his voice barely more than a growl, "you don't want to be making all that noise. We're going to take a trip together, you and me. My master's real interested in you." Sonia whimpered, struggling against his iron grip. He pushed himself more tightly against her buttocks. "Don't be afraid. I ain't gonna hurt you. You come with me, don't give me no trouble, and your family will be okay." But the hunger in his voice said otherwise. He chuckled, and she felt her bowels loosen with terror. Suddenly someone was standing between them and the changeling, a greedy presence full of power and rage. The entity was female. She could feel the length of an invisible body pressed against her back. The woman entered her, and Sonia screamed at the unbelievably alien sensation of two inside her skin. Annabelle snatched the werewolf's hand away. Still clutching his wrist, she whirled about with preternatural speed. The werewolf roared in terror, stumbling backwards. He'd been told of the other sleeping inside the girl, yet his master had assured him that she was indeed asleep. She puckered her lips as if to whistle, and mist flowed from her mouth, thickening in the air about them. "No!" Too late the werewolf realized he should have run when he had the chance. His arms dropped to his sides, his face turning slack, his eyes vacant. Annabelle stretched her arms above her head, smelling the night and foliage. She lifted her face to the twin moons, drinking in their glory. "Oh, this feels so good." The vampire turned her attention back to the changeling, eyeing him contemptuously. The young woman hadn't seen him when he'd begun stalking her. Sonia's sorrow had made her listless, and he was fast. "Wonder what his master wants. I guess I could ask him, but he's just a flunky. He won't know nothing." Besides, she had a feeling she already knew, and that their paths had crossed once before. The thirst took her by surprise. She was hungry too, hungry for a man, but she wouldn't touch this creature, though he belonged to her now. What kind of man rapes a woman, especially one as young as Sonia? Such a man wouldn't be worth her time. But I can drink. She blurred to the werewolf, her face inches from his, pressed her lips to his neck, and sank her fangs into his flesh. When she lifted her mouth, she saw without remorse that his hair had gone completely white. Deep lines had appeared in his face too. She didn't know how many years she'd stolen. He might live another 10 years, or another day. Annabelle put her fingers to his cheek, turning his face so that his vacant eyes met hers. "Now you listen to me. Go tell your master if he wants to meet me, he got to come to me himself. Tell him if he sends another one of you, or a whole group, I'm going to send him back bodies. You understand?" The werewolf nodded, lips quivering. Even in his delirium, he was afraid of her. "Good. Now get out of my sight." He turned and shambled off to do her bidding. She licked her lips. The feeding had aroused her even more. Sonia's screams woke her family, but the spell had lulled them back to sleep. Tomorrow they would remember her cries as only pieces of a dream. "I can fly through this city and find a man, a real man. Take all night if I want." Annabelle pursed her lips. "No, she's sleeping, but if I push too hard, she might wake up. She'd be scared out of her mind if she woke up under a strange man." When Sonia had been with Darren, she'd been tempted more than once to come forward and show what she could do. Teach him what he could do with the right woman. The boy held such promise, but that would have spoiled everything. Annabelle knew how to be patient, how to wait. She'd waited for centuries. There was still time. Time enough to claim what was hers. Chapter 7. The Proposal. At midnight, Annabelle heard a whisper outside the window, calling her by the ancient name of her birth. She stepped outside the mirror, a dark, voluptuous gal with a mane of thick hair, and floated over to the bed where Sonia slept. Annabelle lay on top of her and fused with her. For a moment, Sonia twisted restlessly in her sleep. The vampire jumped to the floor, tipped through the hallway and down the stairs. Outside, a slender, cream-colored indigo man with blue eyes stood on the scraggly grass waiting for her. He was dressed in the black tunic and slacks of a Planet Loyalist. Hector stepped forward and inclined his head. "I'll eat. So good to see you. It's been a long time." Annabelle curled her lip. "Not long enough. I figured it was you. You must be out of your mind sending that fool to snatch me the other night." He grinned, a hungry predator baring his teeth. "My servant died, you know." The demon raised his eyebrow sardonically. "Of old age. You didn't have to kill him. He was only following orders. I got carried away." She smiled coldly. "He had plans for this body that didn't sit well with me. Why are you here?" "To see if you'd taken possession of the girl. That doesn't concern you." "Annabelle, we're old friends." The demon spread his hands, palms outward as a show of goodwill. "What's the harm in stopping by to say hello?" She chuckled contemptuously. "We're many things, demon, but friends ain't one of them." Hector's eyes glittered. "Your new host body is very attractive, by the way. Please give my compliments to the owner." The demon was baiting her. This wasn't her body. She had no body. She was a ghost, a wraith reduced to stealing flesh from the innocent. Annabelle glared at him and leaned against the porch railing, a smile playing about her full lips. "How's your brother?" she asked, matching his light tone. "I always liked Teotep. He had an eye for the ladies, and a way with them too, as I remember." They were trading insults now, and she made a direct hit. Women found him repulsive. Hector pressed his lips together. "It was because of his weakness for humans, his desire for the woman Carla, that he was imprisoned. I've been sent here to clean up his mess." The indigo woman rolled her eyes. "That song's already been sung. You lost the war, remember? Your prophecy was a lie. You've been misinformed. If you'd put aside your human toys for a minute, you'd realize that the others were murdered, just as foretold, but the guardians resurrected them." He bared his teeth in a hideous grin. "They broke the rules. We can still seize power." "So what?" "The mortals of this century stand in the midst of revolution," Hector hissed, "and we stand in the eye of the storm. If they succeed, and they will if we don't stop them, they'll create a utopia, a new world without hunger or war, all the things that sustain us." Annabelle's eyes flashed angrily. "All the things that sustain you. I don't give a damn one way or the other," she snarled. "I am eternal. What care I for mortals and the comedies they play?" "Don't you ever consider anyone's needs but your own?" "No, I don't, and I'm going back to bed." As the vampire pushed away from the railing, Hector blurred toward her. She spun round to meet him, eyes half-lidded and dangerous. "If he dares touch me." The demon pulled up short. Spirit though Annabelle was, she was still a powerful force, and not to be underestimated. "Let me put it this way," Hector said softly. 4 of the others who imprisoned Teotep are here in this time. Do you think they'll just sit back and let you kill off their precious humans?" Now it was her turn to look uneasy. "I'm always careful. I never take more than I need. I'm not greedy like you." She spat these last words with contempt. "They won't care how careful you are," Hector said softly. "You steal from Innocence. You kill. Slowly, maybe, over a period of years, but that still makes you a murderess. They're magical creatures, just like us. They'll smell you, and they'll come for you. She cupped her elbows and stared reflectively off into the distance. At length she asked, "What do you want?" "Help me dispose of the others. Once they're dead, you can either join me as co-ruler or step back into your cozy little existence." Annabelle studied him for a moment. She nodded. "When will you take the girl?" "Give me 1 week," she said quietly. "In a week's time, one of my servants—" At this her face narrowed in anger. "All right, I will meet you here at midnight," Hector finished. She turned to go. "And Alrete?" "Yes," Annabelle answered, her voice heavy with irritation. He spoke softly. "Don't ever think about double-crossing me." She whirled around to face him, easily slipping back into her drawl. Somehow it made her low-charged words even more ominous. "Let that be the last time you threaten me. It ain't good for your health. I'd hate for you to find out just how unhealthy." The vampire climbed the steps, her mind consumed with the dilemma she was now faced with. "I can't trust him. If I help him do this, help him murder those folks, he'll kill me the first chance he gets. But I can't let them live either." Chapter 8. Angels and Bandits. The council sat in their dining nook, their evening meal of red beans and rice before them. Warriors stood guard in front of their house and were spread along the block. The guards lived on the same street, each home built so that it shared a wall with its neighbor. At midnight, another shift would emerge from their brownstones to replace them. Bronze José was there, tan and slender with hazel eyes, an ever-present toothpick protruding from his full lips. Joan sat next to him, a copper woman with a long face, burnt sienna skin and slanted eyes, her unbound hair hanging to her waist. Across from them sat Consuela, a plump bronze woman with sepia-colored skin and a curly mane of hair around her heart-shaped face, and her lover Mark, thin and fuchsia with green eyes and a mop of unruly blonde hair. Naomi sat at the head of the table, indigo, buxom, and middle-aged, her skin the color of brown sugar. Her wide nose and thick lips were framed by 2 afro puffs. Her lover Michael sat beside her, copper and also in his 40s, with a hooked nose and reddish-brown skin, his hair hanging to his broad shoulders. José, Consuela, Mark, and Joan shared the little house. Naomi lived next door with Michael. The council were paid a monthly stipend from municipal and could have relocated to a wealthier neighborhood, but they insisted on living among the people they served and used most of their salary to fund the food and housing programs they'd put in place. "I've got my report if everyone's ready," said Naomi. "The soil regeneration seems to be working, as long as we rotate the crops. Topaz's greenhouses should be up and running within the year, 2 years tops." "I'm trying to recruit more scientists for this project," Mark offered. "Excellent, because the plan is to partner with Tundra's other provinces. The vegetables we can't grow, we'll trade with them through a barter system." "A lot of citizens are growing gardens," the blond man said. "I think we should encourage it by giving away seeds, as long as the soil they're using hasn't been quarantined. We can announce this during our next news broadcast and give them a location to pick it up." Naomi smiled. "Groovy. I second your offering." "What about our meat production?" asked Consuela. José raised his hand. "That's my department and no go. Tundra will officially be out of meat within 5 years." "How do you run out of meat?" "Because Tundra consumed it at a higher rate than animals reproduced. Those left are on our list of endangered species." José shook his head ruefully. "We gotta come up with something, or the whole planet is gonna have to go vegetarian." Mark looked thoughtful. "That doesn't sound like such a bad idea. Cheese, milk, and beans supply the same protein as meat, right?" "I was thinking the same thing," said Joan. "Why don't we put that one on the back burner for now? We can revisit it later. As far as housing goes, we all know that Topaz is full of squatters, right? Homeless who move into condemned houses to get off the street. Hell yeah, Consuela said emphatically. I don't blame them, but there have been cases of fires and folks falling through rotten ceilings. Exactly, Joan agreed. Well, I think we should put folks back to work by rebuilding old houses and moving citizens in. We can work out the payment details, but it could be subsidized by us or through municipal. Consuela grinned. I decide. And seconded. We'll rent them for whatever folks can afford, or just let them move in for free if they don't have any income. But we better start purchasing properties fast before the corporations get wind of it. They'll burn them to the ground to keep us from getting them. Sounds good, Michael added. On a less positive note, cases of enforcer brutality are on the rise. Citizens have been beaten to death and tasered on their way to detention. The arresting officers claim they were trying to escape. There are still some honest peacekeepers left, but they're afraid they'll be murdered if they speak out. The council's faces darkened. Jose fingered the toothpick in his mouth. We got to find a way to rein these vatos in. We need a watch group, enforcers and citizens who see this kind of shit. Can even make a report anonymously. The group should compile a list of rogue enforcers and then meet with us once or twice a week. Joan raised her hand. Seconded. These pigs need to know somebody's watching and that we will prosecute. I'll spearhead this one, said Michael. I can have it set up by our next console broadcast. The copper man smiled grimly. Our reporters are driving the corporations crazy. They can't figure out how we got our hands on the technology. Pendejos, Consuela drawled contemptuously. Don't they realize they can't hide knowledge forever? Their heads are stuck so far up their asses, the only thing they see is their own shit. The council snickered. That group better be made up of folks you can trust, the copper man added. We got leaks in the movement. Snitches? She asked, and Michael nodded. From where? He shrugged. Some of the volunteers, maybe even the warriors. But we handpicked those folks ourselves, Consuela protested. Baby, sometimes folks like to talk, to brag, you know. And when you're running your mouth, somebody's always listening. All I know is, intel is finding its way back to the corporations. Information they got no business knowing. There was a weighted silence. At length Joan said, Well, I guess we're the new watch group. She cut her eyes at the others. And some extra patrolling wouldn't hurt. Their answers were heard in her mind. For sure. Groovy. Done deal. The demon gazed out his window, hands clasped behind his back, his thick hair pulled into a ponytail. Hection's building was in the center of downtown. His scientists lived in the skyscraper next door. The first 3 floors of their building had been gutted and replaced with laboratories. The women and men had worked feverishly for months, using research and sorcery to perfect their food cloning process. They were lavishly paid and terrified of him. Both had helped speed things along. Beside them, like tripod beehives, were the 10 municipal complexes. At the end of the street stood the detention center, enclosed by a barbed wire fence. Topaz's municipal government took orders from Hection, and 4 other corporate centuries scattered across the city. The centuries in turn networked with other world corporations, and a mammoth spiderweb of wealth and power. The demon owned the entire building, but his penthouse suite was on the top floor. His furnishings were crafted from black marble and steel. Behind him and to the right was a kitchen with a bar, and next to it his living area. The apartment had 2 bathrooms with sunken tubs, each large enough to fit a bed into, a library and a den, Embedded in the wall across the room was